Everyone loves a beautiful flower, but why do plants make them? Are they Are they just for looks or is there a reason? Well, actually the flower is a part of the plant that makes the seed. And each part of the flower has a very important job. Up on the board I have a close-up of some flowers. Now if you look very closely at this part, you can see pollen. There's pollen on these tips. So this part of the plant makes the pollen on these little tips. Have you ever smelled a flower like a lily a little bit too close and gotten yellow? So this part of the plant makes the pollen on these little tips. Have you ever smelled a flower like a lily a little bit too close and gotten yellow powder all over your nose? If you have, that was probably the pollen is powdery. Now, when some of this pollen gets on this part right here, that's a certain plant part of the plant. When some of the pollen gets on it, then the flower is pollinated, and when the flower is pollinated, then seeds form near the middle of the flower. Often the seeds are covered and protected with a type of fruit. Now there are a few ways that a plant can be pollinated. Some plants can pollinate themselves using self pollination. Other plants can be pollinated by the wind. But the most common way that flowers are pollinated is by insects or other animals. Now, the bee is one insect that helps to pollinate many flowers. When a bee lands on a flower, pollen collects of the bee's body. See all this pollen that's collected on its leg, legs, legs, and on its body. And when the bee lands on a flower and touches the part that needs the pollen, then the flower is pollinated and a seed can form. Now, if you look very closely at this bean plant, you can see that this tiny pot is starting to form, and up here there's a really small one. Little pots are starting to form, and inside the pots are the seeds of the bean plant, tiny little beans. And you can see on the tip of the pods there's petals that have dried out because the pods came from flowers that were pollinated by, and then the seed formed. Noticed that the seeds are covered with a pot for protection. The seed formed and they are still growing, but you can see that some of the petals are still holding on to the tip. Now different kinds of plants have different kinds of seeds and different kinds of things that cover and protect the seeds. When the flower on a pea plant is pollinated, seeds form inside a pea pod. See, here's the flowers of a pea plant. And when the flowers are pollinated, then The seeds are inside a pea pod. When the flower on an apple tree is pollinated, seeds form inside an apple. So here are flowers on an apple tree. And when bees come or other animals or insects and pollinate the flowers, then the seeds are formed in the middle of the apple. I'm sure you've seen those when you cut open an apple. The little brown seeds that are formed inside an apple. So there is a lot more to a flower than just is looks, for even its smell. The looks and smell of a flower are what attract the animals and insects that come or pollinated the flower. The insects come who are looking for food. The looks and smell of a flower are what attract the animals and insects that come and pollinate the flower. The insects come who are looking for food. They came and land on the flower. The pollen gets on their bodies and they get nectar. Then some of the pollen gets onto the certain part of needs it and the flower is pollinated and the seed forms.